Hi, I'm John Stevenson, and we're going to be looking at Ezra chapters 1 through 6 in our continuing study of the historical books of the Old Testament. I want to start, first of all, about talking on the authorship of this book. We don't know who it is. Uh, the book has the title Ezra that has been affixed to the page, although I don't know if the title was the original part of the book. Um, but the author is not named. It serves as a sequel to First and Second Chronicles. Now you say, why didn't you say sequel to First and Second Kings? The reason I say that is because the last two verses of Second Chronicles will be repeated word for word in Ezra chapter 1. And so there's just like a really neat sort of handing off and picking up just as we left off in the book of Ezra. Now, when I say that, First Chronicles, if I look at the genealogies there, some of those genealogies are from, they go all the way back to Adam, but there are some of them that follow a timeline after the return from Babylon, and not just after the return from Babylon, but quite a few generations after that return, which means that First and Second Chronicles were not written immediately after the return from Babylon, but actually quite a number of generations later. Maybe quite a bit, maybe 100 or 150 years later, a long time later, and maybe even a little bit longer, just from those genealogies, which means that the book of Ezra also would have been written quite a bit later if it's written after as a sequel to First and Second Chronicles. Just sort of look at the overall approach there. Now, it's found in the Hebrew Bible as one book with Nehemiah. I don't know for sure that it started that way or if that was a later connection that was made. There is some there's reason why they connected. There's some very common themes. Um, and yet Nehemiah at portions, he's going to switch to the first person. He's actually going to be praying to the Lord. So Nehemiah is actually going to read like a diary. And yet at some time, Ezra and Nehemiah were stuck together, and our Jewish friends will count them oftentimes as one book when they're counting the books of the Hebrew Bible. So we have in Ezra, we start off the first 6 chapters. That's what we're going to look at now. Zerubbabel's narrative, the narrative of Zerubbabel, this descendant of King David, who leads the people back into the land, and they begin the process of rebuilding the temple. Next, there is Ezra's narrative. Now that takes place like 55 years later. And so Zerubbabel's probably dead and buried, and now Ezra's story comes up where he brings some more people back to the land. And when they get back to the land, the temple is there, but they need to fix some things in the temple, not physical things, well, maybe some of those too, but some of the spiritual problems that are beginning to arise. And then we turn to the book of Nehemiah, and Nehemiah's story, again, is a bit later after that, another 10 years after that or so, where Nehemiah comes back to rebuild the walls of the city, but also to set in line some of the things that were going on in the temple. So the temple narrative, the temple story is going to be found really in all three of these narratives. I want you also notice that there are sections of Ezra, chapters 4:8 to chapter 6:18, and also chapter 7, verses 12 through 26. These sections are written in the Aramaic language. Now, Aramaic is a lot like Hebrew, but it's not Hebrew. In the same way that there are languages, for example, I have a number of Portuguese students, and they tell me, because I wouldn't be able well, maybe I could tell, I don't know. But they tell me that Portuguese and Spanish are very close. If you can understand one, you can sort of puzzle out a lot of the other. Uh, Latin is similar too, and Italian, because these all came from Latin, just Latin spoken in different locations and gradually changed. Well, Aramaic and Hebrew are also very much alike. Our story begins now with Cyrus the Great. He's the king who brought together the Medes and the Persians, who had been two separate people. The Medes had in the past sort of lorded it over the Persians, but he changes that. He's a Persian who binds these two peoples together, and then he is challenged way over in the west by the king of the Lydians, by King Croesus. and King Croesus actually is going east to make an attack, and instead Cyrus doesn't wait for him, and he attacks the king of the Lydians, and there's a whole story there that we can't get into. Great story. Look it up sometime about the Croesus and the story of the city of Sardis, which is alluded to, I think, in Revelation chapter 3, but we don't have time for that. After that, Cyrus comes back, and he comes against Babylon, and to hear the way he tells the story. I know there's some stories that were told much later about some of the tactics that he used, but the way he tells the story, he just walked up to the city of Babylon, and they opened the gates, and he walked in and took over. There was a ruler there. The king of Babylon had been Nabonidus, but he had vacated the city. He had gone way down to the south and wasn't really interested in political shenanigans. And so instead, he had left his son Belshazzar, and that story is told in Daniel chapter 5. And so Cyrus comes in and captures the city, and Belshazzar is killed, and Cyrus is the new king of Babylon, but also what has now become an entire Persian empire. Our story picks up in Ezra chapter 1, verse 1. Now, in the first year of Cyrus, king of Persia, he had just managed to take over everything, including Babylon, and all in that first year, in order to fulfill the word of the Lord by the mouth of Jeremiah. Jeremiah, on two different occasions, had prophesied that Babylon would fall, and then that somebody else would come, and the Israelites would be allowed to return. So this is that prophecy that's being fulfilled. The Lord stirred up the spirit of Cyrus of Persia. By the way, notice how the Lord does this. The Lord stirred up the spirit of Cyrus, king of Persia, so that he sent a proclamation throughout all his kingdom and also put it in writing, saying, "Thus says Cyrus, king of Persia, the Lord, the God of heaven, has given me all the kingdoms of the earth." By the way, God had done this. And he has appointed me to build him a house in Jerusalem, which is in Judah. Whoever there is among all of you of his people, may his God be with him. Let him go up to Jerusalem, which is in Judah, and rebuild the house of the Lord, the God of Israel. He is the God who is in Jerusalem. It sounds like not Ezra, it sounds like Cyrus has become a Christian. Continue to read. Every survivor at whatever place he may live, let the men of that place support him with silver and gold, with goods and cattle, together with a free will offering for the house of God, which is in Jerusalem. Notice, not everybody's going to go back. Not all the Jews are going to go back. But if they don't go back, then at least send their support. Now, we see this and we think, had Cyrus come to believe in the God of Israel? Well, maybe, but I'm not so sure that that's the case, because we have what we call the Cyrus cylinder. And on the cylinder, Cyrus says basically the same thing that he said about the God of Israel, about every other god out there. He comes on the scene and he says, all you people that were dispossessed by those nasty old Babylonians, or maybe earlier by those nasty old Assyrians, I'm the liberator. I'm the good guy. I have come to set you free. Go back to your homes, rebuild your cities, rebuild your temples. Make sure you send me your taxes, because you're now part of the Persian Empire. So you're loyal to me, but you're happy because I'm a nice guy. and he said that to everybody. Now here in Ezra, we have probably the version that he sent to the Jewish people, but he said the same sorts of things to people of all sorts of religions and languages and so on. So that was very clever. It was the politically correct thing to do. But notice we read that the Lord stirred up his spirit. The Lord was behind this. Even though I'm not sure where his heart was, I'm not sure where Cyrus's faith was. The Lord was behind this, even though Cyrus didn't necessarily know the Lord. And Isaiah chapter 45 and verse 1 talks about this. For thus says the Lord to Cyrus, his anointed, whom I have taken you by the right hand. Now, if Isaiah is writing this, and Isaiah lived 150 years before Cyrus comes along, he mentions him by name, but by prophecy. Notice, whom I've taken by the right hand to subdue nations before him, and to loose the loins of kings, to open doors before him, so that gates will not be shut. Continues chapter 44, verse 28. It is I who says of Cyrus, he is my shepherd, and he will perform all my desires. As he declares of Jerusalem, she will be built, and of the temple your foundation will be laid. So Isaiah had prophesied of this, both in chapter 45 and a couple verses earlier here in chapter 44. of Cyrus, even mentioning by name, saying, I've chosen this guy, whether he knows me or not. Notice chapter 45, verse 4, for the sake of Jacob, my servant, and Israel, my chosen one, I have also called you by your name, and I have given you a title of honor. Here it is. Though you have not known me. God did something in the heart of Cyrus. Not, I don't know if necessarily to convert him, but to have Cyrus do God's will. Maybe, well, I don't want to say in spite of himself, because he had his own reasons for doing this. Well, we come to chapter 1 and verse 5. Then the heads of the fathers' households of Judah and Benjamin, and the priests and the Levites arose, even everyone whose spirit God had stirred up to go and rebuild the house of the Lord, which is in Jerusalem. Notice, God had stirred up the spirit, not just of Cyrus, but also of those who by now have been comfortably living. After all, they've been here in Mesopotamia for a few generations, uh, no later than 586 BC, and by now is 539 BC. So you do the math, and that's quite a few years that had passed. And they don't necessarily want to go back, because going back is going to mean there's destruction and there's ruin. And what is there in Judah to go back to, they might think. And yet some will go because the Spirit of God had stirred them up. Verse 6, and all those about them encouraged them with articles of silver, with gold, with goods, with cattle, and with valuables, aside from all that was given as a free will offering. So they're going, and they're going well equipped now to do the work of returning and rebuilding. Verse 7, also King Cyrus brought out the articles of the house of the Lord, which Nebuchadnezzar had carried away from Jerusalem, and put in the house of his gods. So things like the lampstands and the showbread. Now, I don't know if everything had survived, but there was enough that was in storage. And Cyrus, the king of the Persians, says, take that back with you. It's yours. It came from your temple. Take it back and rebuild and use these things, use these accoutrements, these furnishings for the rebuilt temple. And Cyrus, king of Persia, had them brought out by the hand of Mithredath, the treasurer, and he counted them out to Sheshbazzar, the prince of Judah. Now we have to pause a second about this Sheshbazzar. Question is, who is he? One line of thought has it that this is a member of the royal Jewish family, one of the sons of Jehoiachin, who he's going to have 7 sons, and they're mentioned elsewhere. Another view says that this is just another name for Zerubbabel, and people have noticed whenever you see Sheshbazzar mentioned, you're not seeing Zerubbabel. Whenever you see Zerubbabel mentioned, you're not seeing Sheshbazzar. So a little bit like Clark Kent and Superman, it's not two different people, although they are going by different names, that it's the same person. And I admit that is tantalizing, but I still think that what we have here are two different people. So I'm going to go with the first one. That First Chronicles chapter 3, verse 18, is going to list 7 sons of Jehoiachin. One of those sons is going to be someone named Shenazar, which sounds a lot like Sheshbazzar, and has been suggested that this could serve as an alternate spelling of the same name. For example, you have Jonathan and John, and by the way, if I go to Russia, they want to call me Ivan, or in Spain it's Juan, but it's the same name. Same idea here, just different variations on the same name. I think that, now maybe I'm wrong, but I think that's the better explanation. So that means that we have Sheshbazzar as the uncle of Zerubbabel, and let me just say they're going to be on the same page. They're going to be working really closely together, and so you'll sometimes read about one and sometimes read about the other, and I think that they're working so hand in hand that, and eventually we're just going to see Sheshbazzar sort of phased out. Maybe he dies somewhere along the way, and it's just going to be Zerubbabel. And they're both going to be described as the governors. It may be that Sheshbazzar started off as the governor, but he had as his right-hand man Zerubbabel, if that's the case. And so when there's a changing of the guard. It's so working together that you almost don't notice. Now, chapter 1 then had the decree of Cyrus that we just looked at. We come to chapter 2, and there is a census of those who returned. So we start off with an introductory statement, chapter 2, verse 1. Then the number of the people of Israel, they are numbered in verses 2 through 35. Next, we see the numbering of the priests, and then the numbering of the Levites. Then we find that there were certain Levites who could not give evidence as to their genealogy. The records had been lost, and they've been told that they are Levites, and they're believing it, but they can't prove it. There's no evidence for it. Notice chapter 2, verse 59, but they were not able to give evidence of their fathers' households and their descendants, whether they were of Israel even. So that was a little bit of a problematic thing. And then verses 61 through 63, there were priests who were excluded because they were unclean. And the final count then is given in the last few verses, the final count of the people, the possessions, the offerings, and everything's ready. Now they're going to travel, but they don't do that until chapter 3. So chapter 2, verses 64, starting in verse 64, we read, the whole assembly numbered 42,360. I mean, that's down to the nearest 10. Sometimes we round off numbers, but this is rounded off pretty exactly. Besides their male and female servants, who numbered 7,337. That's exact. And they had 200 singing men and women. Their horses were 736. Their mules 245. Their camels 435. Their donkeys 6,720. A lot of donkeys there. But everything's numbered, everything's prepared, they're ready to travel. And so chapter 3, verse 1, now when the 7th month came, 7th month, now that's not July, that's not the English 7th month, that's reckoned in Jewish time, with the first month being right in the time of the Passover, corresponding roughly to around our March. It might not be exactly, but close enough. So the 7th month is going to be what we think of as, again, in the neighborhood of September. In fact, septus in Latin, our word for September, actually means 7. Because even in Roman times, when the names of the months were given, the year started a little bit later than our year starts. So we read verse 2, then Yeshua, the son of Jozadak, and his brothers, the priests, and Zerubbabel, the son of Shealtiel, and his brothers, arose and built the altar of God to Israel. They've made it back into the land. They're building an altar there to offer burnt offerings on it, as it is written in the law of Moses, the man of God. So they're back in the land. They're building an altar. They're going to begin the worship of the Lord. Verse 4, they celebrated the Feast of Booths. I think that's significant. By the way, that's in the 7th month. That's when that takes place. As it is written, and others, the fixed number of burnt offerings daily, according to the ordinance, as each day required. So they're doing the sacrifices, but the Feast of Booths, that's a feast where they come back into the land, and they are required, whether they're into the land or out of it. The way you keep that feast is you camp out. You say, well, what happens if you have your own house? You don't really need to camp. Well, you camp out anyway. The idea, you move out of your house and you move to some place, maybe just right outside the door. But you set up a temporary booth. That's why it's called the Feast of Booths, some sort of temporary dwelling. And you live in that temporary dwelling to remind you of the time when the Israelites had first come out of the land of Egypt, of that time when they didn't have homes. And so they're sort of revisiting that past. I've got a friend who's a Messianic rabbi, and he and his wife will be in the next month or so. We're getting close to that right now as I'm recording this. In the next month or so, they're going to be moving out, and they were just checking with like a local park in northern Florida, and they're going to be living in tents for a week, because that was the requirement here of the Feast of Booths, to remind them, yes, there was a time when God's people lived in tents, but I think there's another thing there too, to remind us that we live our lives in temporary booths. These bodies that we have in which we tabernacle, they're temporary. They're not going to stay around forever. And there's coming a day when they will either be replaced or fall apart or something. Um, and it's a reminder also of how God tabernacled with his people, both in the Old Testament when he dwelt in a tent, but also in the sense of Jesus who came and tabernacled with us. The Word became flesh and tabernacled with us. And he came and lived in a earthly, if I can call the human body, a tabernacle as well. Verse 8, now in the second year of their coming to the house of God at Jerusalem, in the second month, Zerubbabel the son of Shealtiel and Yeshua the son of Jozadak, and the rest of their brothers, the priests and the Levites, and all who came from the captivity to Jerusalem, began the work and appointed the Levites from 20 years and older to oversee the work of the house of the Lord. They're going to start actually building. They already came back and started worshiping, but now they're going to start building the actual temple, or I should say rebuilding. It had been there in the past, but it had been destroyed by the Babylonians. And so they begin the work, and we read, old men wept with a loud voice. Why would old men weep? Because they had seen the original temple, and they're seeing it beginning to rise again. And many shouted aloud for joy, and it was a tremendous time. Chapter 4, verse 1, now is the problem, when the enemies of Judah and Benjamin heard that the people of the exile were building a temple to the Lord, the God of Israel, they approached Zerubbabel and the heads of fathers' households and said to them, let us build with you, for we, like you, seek your God, and we have been sacrificing to him since the days of Esarhaddon, king of Assyria, who brought us up here. Now, you have to understand what had happened. When the northern kingdom of Israel had been taken away into captivity, those were the 10 tribes. Other people had been brought in from outside to settle that land. There might have been a few that were left behind, and they sort of mixed and incorporated with them. But those who had been brought back in had been instructed, hey, there's a God already that lives here, so you need to learn about that God. And they had done so. They'd been sacrificing to the God, probably not in the right way. Remember, the northern kingdom of Israel had been using golden idol, what do you call it, golden calves, both at Bethel and at Dan. And so maybe they had picked up some of those wrong practices. So here they are. They've been sacrificing, I'm assuming, to the right God, but maybe in the wrong way. And they've been doing that and maybe putting some of their own religious system into it. So they have strayed a bit, whether they mean to or not. And they show up and they say, we want to join you. Now, notice they are described here in the opening part of the verse, the enemies of Judah and Benjamin. I'm not sure they saw themselves that way and in the beginning, but they are going to turn into those enemies, if they are not already. They're going to turn into those who were at enmity with the people of God. And so verse 3, but Zerubbabel and Yeshua and the rest of the heads of the fathers' households of Israel said to them, you have nothing in common with us in building a house to our God. But we ourselves will together build to the Lord God of Israel, as King Cyrus, the king of Persia, has commanded us. So no pagan altars, no pagan things, no wrong way of worshiping God. We're doing this, and what got us into trouble in the past, and what maybe had gotten them into the ones in the north in the same sort of trouble in the past, is they had amalgamated with other peoples who brought their gods, who brought their worships, who brought their other ways of doing things that were not God's ways. And so, they have a weakness to that. It's like it's a little bit like the alcoholic who says, "No, I don't really want to come to your wine tasting party because that's going to lead me into problems." And I think that's what's happening here. So, verse 4, then the people of the land discouraged the people of Judah. Now they do become enemies, if they weren't already, and frightened them from building, and hired counselors against them to frustrate their counsel all the days of Cyrus, king of Persia, even until the reign of Darius, king of Persia. So notice we're going to go from Cyrus, who was the king who had given permission, and there's going to be another king eventually, although Now, it's not mentioned here, but there's also one in between. But there's going to be a Darius king of Persia, but he's not on the scene yet. But this this animosity, this hatred, this this enmity is going to it picks up. It's seen here, and it's going to continue for quite some time. Verse 6 says, "Now in the reign of Ahasuerus, in the beginning of his reign," the term there, Ahashyerosh, in the beginning of his reign, they wrote an accusation against the inhabitants of Judah and Jerusalem, an accusation of, they're going to make up some things about the Jews they're building, and these are rebels, and you shouldn't let them, and you should stop them. Um, uh, Now, that term Ahasuerus, I tend to think it might be a royal title, because we had Cyrus. But notice that this wasn't the beginning of the reign of Cyrus. This is the beginning of the reign of somebody else. And in the next verse, verse 7, "And in the days of Artaxerxes, Bishlam, Mithredath, Tabeel, and the rest of his colleagues wrote to Artaxerxes." Notice you had Ahasuerus mentioned in verse 6. In the next verse, you have this person, Artaxerxes, mentioned, Artasharshita. And Artaxerxes, the one we know as Artaxerxes, is going to come around a lot later, like maybe 40 years later. And so this just doesn't seem to fit unless this term isn't actually referring to the one we know as Artaxerxes, but maybe this is referring to Cambyses, that is the son of Cyrus, who picks up after Cyrus is killed, who picks up and who is emperor for just a few years. I think that might be the answer. Verse 23. "Then as soon as the copy of King Artaxerxes' document was read before Rehum and Shishai the scribe and their colleagues, they went in haste to Jerusalem." So they write to the emperor, the new emperor who's just become emperor, and he writes back, and notice they went in haste to Jerusalem to the Jews and stopped them by force of arms. And then the work on the house of God in Jerusalem ceased, and it was stopped until the second year of the reign of Darius, king of Persia. Now, just so you know, you're going to have Cyrus and then Cambyses. Here, maybe is the same one who's being called Artaxerxes here. And then you're going to have Darius, and then you're going to have um, Xerxes after this, and then you'll have Artaxerxes. So the Artaxerxes that we know from history isn't going to come about for a long time. I think this is an earlier king who happens to have the same name. And so we had Cyrus, who had given permission to rebuild. It was now in the time of Cambyses that our passage here is calling Artaxerxes, but that might have been another of his names. Cambyses, under him the construction is halted. And what we're going to see is that it will remain halted now until, and this is going to come up now in chapter 5, where Haggai and Zechariah will prophesy and urge the construction to begin again. Chapter 5, verse 1, "When the prophets Haggai," and that's the same one who writes our book of Haggai, the prophet, "and Zechariah," and that's also the same one who writes the book of Zechariah in our Old Testament. So both these prophets, the son of Iddo, prophesied to the Jews who were in Judah and Jerusalem in the name of the God of Israel, who was over them. Then Zerubbabel, the son of Shealtiel, and Yeshua, the son of Yozadak, he's the high priest, they arose and began to rebuild the house of God, which is in Jerusalem, and the prophets of God were with them, supporting them. And so notice, we have work on the temple had stopped. It had been ordered stopped. And then these prophets, Haggai and Zechariah, get up and say, and if you want to know what they said, go look at Haggai. He asked the question, why are you living comfortable in your houses when the house of God isn't finished? Go start it up again. And they do, even though they don't have permission from the emperor of the whole Persian Empire. So they prophesy, and as a result of that, the work on the temple begins again. And now, not quite a few years have passed. This didn't happen overnight, but now at the right time, they work. By the way, that emperor who had ordered it stopped, by now he has died. He had a fairly short term. I'm not going to go into the details of his story, but he had gone down to Egypt, and then he had heard about some domestic troubles back home, and he had been doing like military conquests in Egypt, flashing his sword around. And I heard about the trouble back home. He jumped on his horse, forgot that his sword was sticking out of the saddle. At least that's the way the story goes. And nicked an artery and bled out and died with just a silly accident. Well, chapter 5, verse 3, at that time, Tateni, the governor of the province beyond the river, and Shethar-bozenai and their colleagues came to them and spoke to them thus: Who issued you a decree to rebuild this temple and to finish the structure? Remember, they don't have permission from the Persian emperor who had ordered it stopped. Now, that Persian emperor is dead, but there's a new one who had come on the scene by the name of Darius. We call him Darius the Great. And he had risen, so he wasn't the son of the previous emperor. He was like a distant cousin, but he had risen up. And again, I'm simplifying. A number of things had happened, but he's the emperor now, and he hasn't given permission. Notice verse 4. Then we told them, oh, by the way, notice the we. This is starting to read like a personal diary. Then we told them, according to what the names of the men were, who were reconstructing this building. Let me just say, that's not Ezra. He hasn't been born yet. We're not going to see him until chapter 7. The we is somebody that was on scene there. Verse 5, but the eye of their God was on the elders of the Jews, and they did not stop them until a report could come to Darius, and then a written reply be returned concerning him. So sure enough, the report goes all the way to Darius, who is now the emperor of the Persian Empire. And so a letter's written to the Persian emperor. It has to make the transit, and then he has to read the letter, and then a reply is written from the Persian emperor back to those who had first written this complaint. Now, again, what we've had here, we started with Cyrus the Great, who had given them permission to rebuild. And then under Cambyses, the construction had been halted. But Cambyses, he's now dead. There's a new emperor on the throne, and the letter comes to Darius. And Darius hears about this complaint. He says, I want an investigation. And in the investigation, they come up with the original letter that Cyrus the Great had written, giving permission to rebuild. And he says, oh, you mean that permission had been given by my distant cousin Cyrus the Great, who was emperor, a few times before me? In that case, they can continue. I'm giving them permission to rebuild, sort of after the fact, since they have already started, and we will pay for it by the local treasury. After all, it's their tax money. We'll put their tax money to work, and we'll help finance the building project. So notice here's the wording, chapter 6, verse 8. The full cost is to be paid to these people from the royal treasury out of the taxes of the provinces beyond the river, and that without delay, just in case anybody wanted to slow up the payments there. Then Tatani, the governor of the province beyond the river, Shethar-bozenai, and their colleagues carried out the decree with all diligence, just as King Darius had sent. You don't mess around when Darius speaks. So notice back in chapter 4, we had the opposition, some hostile correspondence that led to the work being shut down, the king's letter and then the king's negative reply. We saw that back in chapter 4. Now we see, again, an opposition letter, hostile correspondence again, but this time the reply from the emperor, this time the reply from Darius is very different. And so the enemies had their letter, but the king gives a positive reply. No, they can finish. And so they're going to continue the work, and they are going to complete it. The temple will be completed. We read in chapter 6, verse 14, and the elders of the Jews were successful in building through the prophesying of Haggai the prophet and Zechariah the son of Iddo. And they finished building according to the command of the God of Israel and the decree of Cyrus, Darius, and notice there's now we see, and Artaxerxes. Well, which Artaxerxes is this? I'm not sure, because there is a later Artaxerxes, king of Persia. All of the, everyone that's in favor of it, say aye, and they do. And then we read that this temple was completed on the third day of the month Adar. It was the 6th year of the reign of King Darius. By our calendar, that would be 516 BC. Exactly 70 years after it had been destroyed in 586 BC. So the Babylonian captivity goes from destruction to the completion of the rebuilding. And notice the sons of Israel, the priests, the Levites, and the rest of the exiles celebrated the dedication of this house of God with joy. They offered for dedication of this temple of God 100 bulls, 200 rams, 400 lambs, and as a sin offering for all Israel, 12 male goats, corresponding to the number of the tribes of Israel, 1 goat for each tribe. So they give the offerings, they give the prayer, they give the dedication, and nothing happens. And you say, well, what did you expect to happen? Well, back when Solomon had built the temple, the Shekinah cloud, the cloud of the presence, the glory cloud had moved into the temple. Back when they had built the tabernacle, Moses had given a prayer of dedication, and God had entered the building. Now, nothing, we don't read about that taking place here. I don't want to dwell on it too much because Ezra doesn't dwell on it too much, but I just want to point that out. And so they appointed the priests to their divisions and the Levites in their orders for the service of God in Jerusalem, as it is written in the book of Moses. They did what they're supposed to do. They've got the worship up and running. The exiles observed the Passover on the 14th of the month. They've even got the feast back up and running. That's good. Remember how the story started, where they first got back into the land and they offered, they observed the Feast of Tabernacles. Now they've completed the temple and it's back at the first of the year again, and they're observing the Passover and presumably all of the other feasts that are going to come throughout the rest of the religious year. For the priests and the Levites had purified themselves together, all of them were pure. Then they slaughtered the Passover lamb for all the exiles, both for their brothers, the priests, and for themselves. The sons of Israel who returned from exile, and all those who had separated themselves from the impurity of the nations of the land to join them to seek the Lord God of Israel, ate the Passover. Now remember, there were those that were in the northern part of the land that weren't really doing that sort of thing. They're excluded. But anybody that comes that's Jewish and comes and separates themselves and cleanses themselves, they are partaking in this observation. And they observed the Feast of Unleavened Bread. That starts with the Passover, but the next 7 days after that, 7 days with joy, for the Lord had caused them to rejoice and had turned the heart of the king of Assyria toward them. You say, King of Assyria? I thought we were talking about the king of Persia. Well, guess what? He's also the king of Assyria, because Assyria has been taken. There is no more Assyria as a separate kingdom. So he is all of the above. Notice the king of Assyria toward them to encourage them in the work of the house of God, the God of Israel. And so we see the outline that we've been looking at, chapters 3 through 6. In chapter 3, it started off, as we said, the celebration before the temple was built. When they first came into the land, they began the sacrifices and they celebrated the Feast of Booths. Then we had the temple construction began. Next, we saw the opposition, the hostile correspondence, and the enemy's letters, and the king. I'm suggesting that is Cambyses, his negative reply. The work on the temple had, as a result of that, stopped. The pivotal point in this entire story had been when Haggai and Zechariah get up and they prophesy. And a few years later, a few years had passed, but now they get up and they prophesy, and work on the temple begins again. Again, we see the opposition with hostile correspondence, but this time the king gives a positive reply. This time he says, you can continue working, and we're going to pay for it. You finally have the temple construction completed. It's finished. And at the end, there is another celebration. This time it's Passover, a celebration after the temple has been built. Now, some applications before we close. First of all, I want you to notice that God is still building a temple. You say, where? I hadn't heard the news. He's building a temple in Israel. No, he's building a temple all throughout the world. We call it the church. We are individually parts of that temple, but collectively, The church is described in the New Testament as a temple. What's a temple? It's a place where God exhibits his presence, and the church is a place where God exhibits his presence both individually and collectively as we come together. Secondly, I want you to see that there's opposition to the building program, just as there was opposition in the days of Ezra, the book of Ezra. Ezra is not born yet. But in the book of Ezra, we see opposition to the building program. There's opposition today. That building takes time. It doesn't happen overnight. It takes commitment. They had to stand up even against the opposition. And it takes endurance. They had to continue to the end. It was interrupted, but then they pick it up and they complete it, and finally they finish it. And finally, I want you to notice that there's celebration at both the beginning and at the end of the story. And that's our story too, because we have celebrated at the beginning. When you first came to Christ, I'm sure that there was celebration going on. If not on earth, then in heaven. Remember how Jesus said, when one sinner repents, there's celebration in heaven. But there's going to be a time of celebration at the end as well. And that's when Jesus comes, and then there will be great celebration.